The air was thick with uncertainty and tension as the diplomats entered the Grand Hall in Paris. Behind those heavy doors lay the fate of empires, battles lost and won, lives shattered, and territories at stake. The 7 Years' War, a brutal conflict spanning continents and oceans, had dragged on for nearly 7 years. Now, after endless bloodshed and costly battles, the world waited with bated breath to see if peace could truly be forged. The Treaty of Paris was not just a treaty, it was a fragile hope for an end to one of history's most devastating wars. The origins of the war were tangled in ambitions and rivalries that stretched back decades. France and Britain had long been locked in a struggle for dominance, each seeking to expand their empires and control lucrative trade routes. The spark was ignited in North America, where the Ohio River Valley became a flashpoint between British settlers pressing westward and French forces determined to protect their colonial claims. Native American tribes, caught in the middle, aligned themselves with one side or the other, each trying to preserve their lands and autonomy amid the chaos. But the war was not confined to North America. In Europe, alliances shifted dramatically. The diplomatic revolution had redrawn old partnerships. Austria allied with France against Prussia and Britain. Russia, Spain, and Sweden each had their stake in the unfolding conflict. Battles raged from the forests of Germany to the plains of India. The war truly became the first global conflict. The British Navy dominated the seas, choking French supply lines and opening pathways for British colonial forces. On land, fierce battles tested the mettle of armies. One of the war's turning points came in 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. British General James Wolfe led a daring assault that resulted in the capture of Quebec, a decisive blow to French power in North America. The victory came at a cost. Both Wolfe and his French counterpart Montcalm died in battle, symbolizing the high price of the struggle. Yet victory did not mean peace. The war drained the coffers of European powers and devastated populations. Countries faced rebellion, famine, and economic ruin. By 1762, with no clear end in sight, leaders from Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal agreed to convene in Paris to negotiate a peace treaty that would redefine borders and ambitions. Negotiations began amidst suspicion and competing agendas. Britain demanded vast territorial gains, seeking to solidify its status as the preeminent colonial power. France, bruised and weary, fought to retain its Caribbean sugar islands, essential to its economy. Spain, allied with France, sought to protect its American possessions and counter British influence. Portugal's interests lay in preserving its South American colonies. The talks were delicate, balancing pride and pragmatism. Each delegation knew the stakes were monumental. A misstep could reignite the war, plunging the world back into chaos. As diplomats debated, the world outside was restless. Indigenous nations watched anxiously, knowing their fate was often decided without their voices heard. Colonists in the Americas questioned how the treaty's terms would affect their futures. The soldiers who had fought the brutal campaigns hoped for a lasting peace, but feared betrayal. After months of complex bargaining, the Treaty of Paris was finally signed on February 10, 1763. Its terms were dramatic. France ceded Canada and all territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, marking the end of its mainland presence in North America. Spain traded Florida to Britain but received Louisiana from France as compensation. Britain emerged as the dominant colonial power, its empire now spanning continents and seas. Yet, the treaty was not the end. It was the beginning of new tensions. Britain's expanded territories would prove difficult to govern, sowing seeds of unrest that eventually sparked the American Revolution. France's loss fueled desires for revenge and reform. Indigenous peoples found their lands increasingly encroached upon, igniting new conflicts. The Treaty of Paris shaped the modern world, illustrating how war and diplomacy are intertwined in the unfolding story of empires. The moment the Treaty of Paris was signed on that cold February day in 1763, a fragile calm settled over a world exhausted by relentless conflict. But beneath the surface, the peace was anything but certain. The treaty had redrawn maps and realigned empires, yet it also planted the seeds of unrest and future turmoil that would soon unfold across continents. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War as the world's preeminent colonial power, its empire stretching from the Caribbean sugar islands to vast new territories in North America and India. The French threat on the mainland of North America had been all but extinguished, but this newfound dominance came with staggering responsibilities and profound challenges. The acquisition of Canada and all French lands east of the Mississippi River gave Britain a massive new domain to govern. Yet, managing this sprawling territory proved difficult. British officials faced the daunting task of integrating French-speaking populations, many of whom remained loyal to their former rulers, while dealing with the complex dynamics of indigenous nations whose lands and lives were irrevocably altered. To stabilize the frontier, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This decree forbade colonial settlers from advancing westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, reserving these lands for Native American tribes. The intention was to prevent further conflicts like Pontiac's Rebellion, a fierce indigenous uprising against British rule. However, this proclamation angered many colonists who had hoped to reap the benefits of westward expansion after the war's end. Tensions between Britain and its American colonies grew steadily. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government looked to its colonies to help shoulder the financial burden through new taxes and tariffs. Acts such as the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed levies on paper, glass, tea, and other goods. Colonists viewed these taxes as unjust, fueling the cry of "no taxation without representation." This growing resentment ignited protests and organized resistance across the colonies. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged to challenge British authority, and events such as the Boston Tea Party became symbols of colonial defiance. The Treaty of Paris, while ending one conflict, inadvertently set the stage for another, the American Revolution. Meanwhile, France grappled with the humiliating loss of its North American empire. Yet the Caribbean sugar islands it retained, such as Guadeloupe and Martinique, were far more economically valuable than the vast but less profitable Canadian territories. French leaders understood that their colonial focus would now shift toward the West Indies and other overseas holdings. The defeat also spurred introspection within France. The financial strain of the war worsened an already precarious economy and increased public discontent. This unrest simmered over decades, eventually boiling into the French Revolution by the end of the 18th century. Spain, as France's ally in the war, suffered losses but also gained. The treaty forced Spain to cede Florida to Britain, a territory it had controlled for nearly 2 centuries. In compensation, Spain received Louisiana from France, a vast and largely unexplored region west of the Mississippi River. This territorial exchange expanded Spanish influence, but presented challenges in governance and defense against both indigenous resistance and British ambitions. The geopolitical map of the world had been profoundly altered, yet the Treaty of Paris revealed how peace settlements rarely bring lasting tranquility. It was a delicate balance of power, constantly shifting and precarious. The indigenous nations found themselves profoundly affected yet largely excluded from the negotiations. Tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, and many others who had allied with European powers during the war now faced an uncertain future. British policies sought to limit colonial encroachment, but settlers ignored or challenged these boundaries, leading to further clashes and displacement. Pontiac's Rebellion, which had begun shortly before the treaty, was a stark example of indigenous resistance to British expansion. Led by the Ottawa Chief Pontiac, a coalition of tribes attacked British forts and settlements in an effort to drive out the new rulers. Although ultimately suppressed, the uprising revealed the volatility of the frontier and the consequences of neglecting indigenous sovereignty. On the global stage, the 7 Years' War and its resolution through the Treaty of Paris demonstrated the increasing interconnectedness of the world. What began as a European power struggle had become a truly global war, fought across continents and oceans, with battles in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and Europe. The treaty reflected this global scope. Its terms affected colonies thousands of miles apart, and its impact rippled through trade networks, military alliances, and political structures. For Britain, the war had solidified its naval supremacy and colonial holdings, but also exposed the limits of empire. Administering distant territories with diverse populations and conflicting interests proved taxing. The financial strain forced Britain into policies that would eventually alienate its American colonies, with consequences that reshaped history. France, though diminished, remained a key player. Its loss fueled ambitions for revenge and reform, laying foundations for revolutionary change. Spain's territorial gains were significant, but came with the challenge of defending vast and diverse lands amid growing European rivalries. The Treaty of Paris also underscored the complexities of diplomacy. Negotiators had to balance national pride with practical concessions, often at the expense of those without a voice: the colonists, indigenous peoples, and enslaved populations who lived under imperial rule. The war and its aftermath exposed the fragile nature of empire, the costs of conflict, and the challenges of peace. The legacy of the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris would echo through decades of revolutionary movements, imperial competitions, and the ongoing struggle for power and identity. In the end, the Treaty of Paris was more than a document. It was a turning point in world history, a testament to the brutal realities of war, the complexities of peace, and the enduring quest for dominance that shapes nations.